Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Tonight, we venture into the shadows of California's Sierra Nevada mountains, where in 1981, a remote cabin became the scene of unimaginable horror. The Keddie murders, a brutal quadruple homicide that left 3 family members and a teenage friend dead, would haunt this small resort town for decades. But what began as a tragic murder investigation soon unraveled into something far more sinister, revealing a web of law enforcement corruption, destroyed evidence, and calculated cover-ups. What really happened that cold April night in Cabin 28? Join me as we peel back the layers of one of California's most disturbing unsolved cases. In the quiet reaches of the Sierra Nevada mountains, nestled among towering pines and forgotten dreams, sits the remnants of what was once the Keddie Resort. On a cold April night in 1981, this sleepy vacation spot became the scene of one of California's most brutal and mysterious murder cases, a case that would haunt investigators and locals for decades to come. Cabin 28 was nothing special to look at, just another weathered wooden structure in a row of similar vacation rentals. The Keddie Resort had seen better days by 1981, becoming more of a low-rent residential community than a tourist destination. This is where Glenna Sue Sharp had chosen to make a fresh start with her 5 children after leaving an abusive marriage in coastal Connecticut. Sue was a fighter, working multiple jobs to keep her family afloat while living in the modest cabin. Her children, John, 15, Sheila, 14, Tina, 12, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, had adapted well to their new surroundings, making friends with other local kids despite their tight circumstances. Among these new friends was Johnny Dana, 15, who had become particularly close to John Sharp. On the night of April 11th, 1981, Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and his friend Johnny Dana were in the cabin's living room. Tina was also home, while Sheila was at a sleepover next door in Cabin 27, and the 2 younger boys were spending the night with friends. None of them could have known that this ordinary evening would end in unimaginable horror. The following morning, Sheila Sharp returned home from her sleepover around 7:45 a.m. As she approached Cabin 28, something felt wrong. The usual morning sounds of her family stirring about were absent. When she opened the door, she stepped into a nightmare that would forever change her life. The scene that greeted her was so grotesque that investigators would later say it was among the worst they'd ever encountered. In the living room lay the bodies of her mother Sue, her brother John, and his friend Johnny Dana. They had been bound with medical tape and electrical wire and subjected to an extraordinarily violent attack. The assailants had used multiple weapons, knives, a hammer, and possibly a wooden stake. The level of violence suggested both rage and premeditation, but there was more. Tina Sharp, Sheila's 12-year-old sister, was nowhere to be found. The youngest Sharp children, mercifully away that night, were spared from witnessing the carnage that had befallen their family. The initial investigation was marked by what can only be described as stunning incompetence or something more sinister. The crime scene was compromised almost immediately. Neighbors and onlookers were allowed to walk through the cabin before evidence could be properly documented. Critical pieces of evidence, including a bloody fingerprint found on a post in the living room, were lost or destroyed. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department, led by Sheriff Doug Thomas, seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crime. But as details emerged, it became clear that their handling of the case went beyond mere incompetence. Promising leads were ignored, and potential suspects, including some with direct ties to law enforcement, were never properly investigated. One such lead involved Martin Smart, who lived in nearby Cabin 26 with his wife Marilyn and friend John Beau Bubeda. Smart had a history of violence and had been seen with Bubeda near Cabin 28 on the night of the murders. More disturbing still, Bubede was revealed to be a former Chicago mob enforcer with a lengthy criminal record, information that somehow escaped the attention of local law enforcement at the time. In the days following the murders, Smart reported that a hammer was missing from his tool collection, a hammer that matched the type of weapon used in the murders. Yet when Marilyn Smart reported this information to the sheriff's department, it was dismissed. Later, she would reveal that Martin had confessed to her that he had killed Sue Sharp because she was interfering in their marriage by counseling Marilyn about leaving her abusive husband. The investigation seemed to actively avoid pursuing these leads. Instead, authorities focused on a series of dead-end theories and appeared more interested in containing information than solving the crime. The behavior of certain law enforcement officials during this period would later raise serious questions about possible corruption and cover-up. Meanwhile, the disappearance of Tina Sharp added another layer of horror to the already devastating case. For 3 years, her fate remained unknown. Then, in 1984, a portion of her skull was discovered near Camp 18, about 50 miles from Keddie. The location was significant. It was an area well known to local law enforcement and timber industry workers, yet somehow it had never been properly searched during the initial investigation. The discovery of Tina's remains should have reinvigorated the investigation, but instead it seemed to prompt even more questionable behavior from authorities. The site where her remains were found was never thoroughly processed for evidence. The remaining portions of her skeleton, which could have provided crucial forensic evidence, were never recovered, or if they were, they disappeared into the same void that had swallowed other key pieces of evidence from the case. As months turned into years, the Keddie murders became a dark legend in Plumas County. The resort itself fell into further disrepair, with Cabin 28 standing as a grim reminder of the tragedy until it was finally demolished in 2004. But while the physical structure may have been razed, the questions surrounding the case only continued to multiply. The surviving Sharp children grew up in the shadow of this unspeakable tragedy. Sheila Sharp, in particular, never stopped seeking answers about what happened that night. Her persistence, along with that of other family members and interested investigators, would eventually help bring new evidence to light. Evidence that would suggest the original investigation had been compromised in ways that went far beyond simple incompetence. In 2013, the case took a dramatic turn when a new team of investigators, led by Plumas County Special Investigator Mike Gamberg, began re-examining the evidence. What they uncovered would shed disturbing new light on both the murders and the original investigation's failures. Among the most shocking discoveries was a letter that had been written by Martin Smart to his wife Marilyn shortly after the murders. The letter, which had been in police possession since 1981 but somehow never properly investigated, contained what appeared to be a confession. "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we're through," Smart had written. Despite this seemingly crucial piece of evidence, Smart was never charged and died in 2000 without ever facing justice. Even more disturbing was the emergence of information suggesting that law enforcement officials might have actively impeded the investigation. Former Plumas County Sheriff's Deputy Leroy Rose came forward with startling allegations. He claimed that during the original investigation, he had received anonymous phone calls warning him to back off from certain aspects of the case. When he reported these threats to his superiors, he was told to drop the matter entirely. The connection between law enforcement and the case's primary suspects began to take clearer shape. John Bubede, it was revealed, had been working as a confidential informant for several law enforcement agencies in California. This relationship might explain why his extensive criminal background was overlooked during the initial investigation, and why leads connecting him to the murders were never properly pursued. The investigation team also discovered that several pieces of physical evidence previously reported as lost had actually been deliberately destroyed. In 2016, a recording emerged of a conversation between two former deputies discussing the disposal of evidence from the Keddie case. This revelation suggested not merely negligence, but an orchestrated effort to prevent the case from being solved. Another breakthrough came when investigators re-examined the site where Tina Sharp's remains were found. Using modern mapping technology, they discovered that the location was directly connected to a property frequented by both Smart and Bubed. Moreover, the property had connections to several law enforcement officials who had been involved in the original investigation. The team also uncovered reports of a suspicious vehicle seen near Cabin 28 on the night of the murders, a vehicle that matched one known to be used by certain law enforcement officers at the time. These reports had been documented but mysteriously removed from the original case files. When confronted with this information, surviving officers from that era claimed no knowledge of the reports, despite their signatures appearing on related documents. The possible motive for the murders began to take shape as well. In the months leading up to the killings, Sue Sharp had reportedly become aware of criminal activities taking place in and around the Keddie resort. Several witnesses came forward to say that she had been planning to report what she knew to authorities outside of Plumas County, distrusting local law enforcement. This distrust may have been well-founded. Further investigation revealed that during the early 1980s, Plumas County had been a hub for drug trafficking, with some law enforcement officials allegedly involved in protecting these operations. The Sharp family's cabin was located in what was believed to be a crucial transit point for these activities. The theory emerged that Sue Sharp had unknowingly stumbled upon this operation, and that her murder, along with the others, was meant to silence her. The excessive violence used in the killings suggested both a warning to others and a personal element to the crimes, consistent with the involvement of someone who knew the victims. The role of Martin Smart and John Bubede began to appear more complex. While they were likely the physical perpetrators of the murders, evidence suggested they may have been acting under the direction or protection of others. Marilyn Smart later revealed that in the weeks before the murders, her husband had several late-night meetings with individuals she believed to be law enforcement officers. The investigation also uncovered evidence that several potential witnesses had been intimidated into silence over the years. One former Keddie resident, who had attempted to come forward with information in 1985, reported being followed and harassed until they left the area. Similar stories emerged from others who had tried to speak up about the case. The demolition of Cabin 28 in 2004, which at the time seemed like a mere property decision, took on new significance. Investigators discovered that the demolition had been rushed through with unusual speed, despite protests from those who wanted to preserve the crime scene for future investigation. More troubling still, several items of potential evidentiary value were removed from the cabin before its destruction and subsequently disappeared. As the new investigation progressed, a pattern of systematic obstruction became clear. Records went missing, witnesses recanted under mysterious circumstances, and promising leads were deliberately misdirected. The question was no longer just who had committed the murders, but who had worked so hard to keep the truth buried for so long. The involvement of higher-level law enforcement agencies became increasingly necessary as evidence of local corruption mounted. The FBI was eventually consulted on aspects of the case, particularly regarding the potential connection to organized crime through Bubed's history as a Chicago mob enforcer. This examination revealed a complex web of relationships between criminal enterprises and law enforcement that extended far beyond Plumas County. The deeper investigators dug into these relationships, the more they uncovered a disturbing pattern of official misconduct that spanned decades. In 2018, Forensic analysis of previously overlooked documents revealed fingerprints belonging to law enforcement personnel on evidence bags that had been reported missing since 1981. This suggested that evidence hadn't simply vanished. It had been deliberately removed from the chain of custody. Perhaps most chilling were the revelations about Tina Sharp's remains. New forensic analysis of photographs from where her skull was discovered showed signs of recent activity at the time, tire tracks and disturbed soil that didn't match the official timeline of when her body was supposedly dumped there. This raised the horrifying possibility that her remains had been moved years after her death, possibly to deflect attention from the original disposal site that might have had more direct connections to the suspects. The investigation team also discovered that Martin Smart had maintained close relationships with several high-ranking county officials even after leaving the area. Phone records showed multiple calls between Smart and the sheriff's department in the years following the murders, long after he had moved away from Keddie. When questioned about these calls, surviving department members claimed they were related to unrelated matters, but could provide no documentation to support this. Another breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a former timber company employee who had worked in the Camp 18 area. He recalled seeing unusual activity in the days following the murders, including law enforcement vehicles in areas that weren't part of any official search grid. More significantly, he remembered being told to avoid certain logging roads during that period, roads that would later prove to be connected to both the disposal site and properties linked to the suspects. The investigation also revealed that John Bubede's role as an informant went deeper than initially suspected. Documents obtained through FOIA requests showed that he had been involved in multiple federal investigations throughout California, often working with different agencies simultaneously. This complex web of allegiances might explain why initial investigators seemed so reluctant to pursue him as a suspect, despite his presence in Keddie at the time of the murders. In 2019, a retired deputy from a neighboring county came forward with information about a conversation he'd overheard in 1981 between two Plumas County officers. They had been discussing the need to contain the Keddie situation, with one saying, "If this gets out, it'll bring down half the department." The deputy had kept quiet for years out of fear, but the recent revelations about corruption convinced him to finally speak up. The investigation team also discovered that several key pieces of evidence that had been labeled as destroyed in official records had actually been transferred to personal storage facilities belonging to former law enforcement officials. While search warrants were obtained for these locations, many had been cleared out just days before they could be executed, suggesting an ongoing effort to obstruct justice. The role of the Keddie Resort's ownership also came under new scrutiny. Property records showed that the resort had changed hands multiple times in the years leading up to the murders, with each transaction involving shell companies that had connections to individuals implicated in the drug trafficking operations. The Sharp family's placement in Cabin 28, initially assumed to be random, may have been deliberately orchestrated to keep them under observation. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the Keddie murders represented more than just a brutal crime. They were a window into a dark period of corruption and criminal conspiracy that had infected multiple levels of law enforcement in Northern California. The deaths of Sue Sharp, her children, and Johnny Dana were likely not just the result of a random act of violence, but rather a calculated move to protect a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years. The case remains officially unsolved, though investigators believe they know the identity of both the killers and those who helped cover up their crimes. Many of the principal suspects are now deceased, and the statute of limitations has expired on many of the related crimes of obstruction and evidence tampering. Yet the investigation continues, driven by the belief that the victims' families deserve to know the full truth, no matter how dark or disturbing it may be. The legacy of the Keddie murders serves as a stark reminder of how corruption can poison the very institutions meant to protect and serve. The case has led to significant reforms in evidence handling procedures and increased oversight of rural law enforcement agencies throughout California. While these changes came too late for the Sharp family, they may help prevent similar tragedies and cover-ups from happening in the future.